So before we jump into the definition of a user persona, I'd like to mention that in most cases we not only have a user persona, but we also need to define a buyer persona. So these two main categories can have two or more different types, and they together form or define our target audience. So let's start with the definition of a persona. So as we said, we have a user and a buyer persona. So a user persona represents the end user, the user who interacts with the product on a daily basis. However, the user persona is not necessarily the one making the decision to buy it. On the other hand, we have a buyer persona, the one making the decision to buy it, to buy the product or a service. So it can include the person making the purchase, but also it could be anyone who influences the opinion or decision, the one buying it. In most cases, the buyer is not the one using the product, so we need to keep that in mind. So the needs and the goals of the buyer might be quite different from the user personas. I'll give you a simple example. Consider a video game console. So who's the buyer persona and who's the user persona here? In this scenario, it's pretty simple. The user persona would be a teen, as they are the ones actively playing or using the console. And on the other hand, the buyer persona would be their parents who decides whether to buy the console or not. In this example, the buyer persona or the parent might be focused on value for money, durability, or even educational content connected to the console. Meanwhile, the user persona, the teenager, cares more about game selection, graphics quality, etc. So as we see, the needs and the goals are quite different for these two types of the personas. Okay, so how do you create a user persona? So the creation process for the persona is based on market research, surveys, and even prior customer feedback can help you develop personas and better understand the user perspective. You need to use your time to think about what your users want, meaning what problem do users have that needs to be solved, what problems and frustrations your product might cause, and most important, how can your product or service meet users' expectations. To conclude everything, a well-defined user persona includes not just demographics, but also motivations, goals, and needs of people who will actually be using your product. So the biggest mistakes when defining user personas are creating personas without any market research and relying on pure assumptions and stereotypes. Second, making too many or too few personas. Next, it would be neglecting buyer personas, then creating personas as fixed profiles rather than evolving with user feedback and market conditions. And lastly, I would say failing to validate personas through user testing. With all the data that you have from creating user personas, you can use it for user interviews to validate your findings. And also, personas are key elements for creating user journeys and to be able to identify key opportunities and pain points.